Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. This is Channel Vision Editor Gerald Baldino here, and today we're welcoming back Bandwidth for a webinar focusing on toll-free myths. Joining us today is Travis Hinton, Product Marketing Manager at Bandwidth, and David Simmons, who is Voice Sales Engineer. Stay tuned for a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. At this point, I'd like to turn the webinar over to Travis to begin. Travis?
Perfect. Thank you, Gerald. Thanks to Channel Vision for having us today, and welcome to the webinar, everybody. My name again, if you missed it the first time around, Travis Hinton. I work on our product marketing team here at Bandwidth. We're focused on developing and activating that go-to-market strategy for voice product suite, and I'm co-presenting today with David Simmons. I want to give you a chance there, David, just to say hey and just a brief word about yourself there as well.
Yep. Thanks, Travis. David Simmons. I'm a sales engineer here at Bandwidth. I handle all the engineering responsibilities, customer-facing responsibilities for our voice products. Been at Bandwidth about 2 years and been in the industry since the late 90s.
Perfect. Quick word about Bandwidth, just as we get rolling here today. We're Bandwidth. We're a software-centric nationwide VoIP network. And what does that mean? Really, it just means that we own and operate our network, and we also own and operate and develop the APIs that help customers across all kinds of different business use cases develop and connect into and integrate voice, messaging, and 911 into their infrastructure, applications, and services. And so, we work with some of the biggest names in the industry when it comes to toll-free service for everything from UCaaS, conferencing platforms, contact centers, CPaaS providers, you name it. We're plugging in toll free, and we have a unique advantage, which we'll kind of talk about as we dig into some of the content today. But we've built and own our own Future Group D network that powers those business critical toll free communications across those use cases and industries. So, wanted to give you just a little bit of that context as we dig in. But let's kind of talk just big picture as to toll-free and the relevancy of toll-free and kind of where we've seen toll-free growing. And this is a timeline slide, so hopefully this is clear enough to show sort of across the top line there is the different 800, the toll-free prefixes that have opened up. Obviously around 1966, 1967-ish, the first toll-free numbers were 800 numbers there. And just it was obviously a very different world back then. The internet has really changed this telecom industry, forever. And you'll see that kind of in the middle there when we start to see an uptick in the number of different prefixes for toll free that are released. And right around that .com bubble, 96, 95, 96 into the early 2000s, we see a massive growth, an explosion of growth there for toll free. And then as we kind of keep going, you see that we're still growing. We're still adding prefixes to try to open up and make sure that there's enough, 800 numbers there to meet the demand. So the proof is really in the demand of growth there. But where do we see that demand and what's driving that growth? When we see it from our perspective at Bandwidth, we look at customer communications and customer connections into the enterprise is where toll-free voice, toll-free connections are really driving that growth. And toll-free numbers really help build those trusted connections between end users and enterprises. You look at popularity of toll-free SMS with omni-channel communications, wanting to create an easy way for someone who's interacting with a business to elevate that conversation from a text to a phone call. And you can do that using toll-free numbers. Significant investments in customer engagement and customer experience and what that all looks like in the enterprise and how to create a really quality connection with their customers. You see it in brand recognition, the 1-800 and then fill in the unique branded number there, brand recognition, as well as consumer confidence. Calling an 800 number or 8XX number is giving you that consumer confidence that you're reaching the enterprise that you're trying to talk to. And then, of course, as we've all experienced lately, that work from home, collaboration, conferencing, if you have to dial in, some of you are probably dialed into this phone call today. So using toll-free numbers to be able to enable that component there as well. And so lots of different ways that we're seeing sort of, upticks in toll-free and how that integrates into the customer service and that customer engagement experience for the enterprise. But how do service providers like you and different enterprises and channel partners tap into this wave of CX? What comes down to making sure that your end user calls can connect, that they're high quality, and that they ensure that you can protect your own revenue along the way. And so what we're going to focus on today, as you know from the title of the webinar, we're going to talk about these 3 top toll-free myths. We're going to bust them. So we're going to dig into each one of these and give it its own time and due diligence there. But the first one of these toll-free myths. So if you've ever thought to yourself, consolidating toll-free with one vendor means that you're single-threaded with a single point of failover. We'll dig into that. We'll talk about why that's a myth and how we can bust that myth. Second one today we're going to go into is the only way to save on costs is to maintain your own RespOrg. Talk a little bit about why that's not true. And then the third we'll get into is giving up RespOrg means that you're going to lose control over your toll-free service. And we'll talk quite extensively about how we see that differently here, how we might bust that myth. So myth number 1, we're going to dig in, and feel free to, as we go, we're going to save time for the end to talk through questions and answers and leave some opportunity to have some of that dialogue. So feel free to add questions into the Q&A throughout the presentation. If you've got questions along the way, we can see those there, and then we'll save some time at the end. So myth number 1, digging right in. Myth number 1, again, consolidating your toll-free with one single vendor means that you're single-threaded with a single point of failover. So, you think to yourself, isn't consolidating with one provider just a massive risk of being single-threaded? And our answer to that is possibly, but it really depends on who you're with, who you go with, and how they manage their network services for toll-free. And so I'm going to introduce you guys to David. He's going to talk a little bit about this. David, you're constantly working with companies on the sales floor, as well as just kind of having those consultative kind of conversations with different companies that are trying to figure out and navigate these challenges. And, we see it across 3 different types of kind of typical setups. And so in your experience, there's kind of the first thing to look at is that single vendor, single carrier model. Could you tell us just a little bit here as you dig in, what's this example scenario? Why does this, how does this work? How do people think about single threadedness in this context? And dig into it a little bit for us in relation to this myth.
Right. So, you think about a toll-free call, right? Somebody picks up the phone, they dial a toll-free number, and then somebody answers that call, and now you got people talking, right? So there's a lot of links between the person that makes the call and the person that receives the call. Typically there's multiple carriers, there's a lot of hops, there can be a lot of hops for a call to jump through. So when you're talking about single threadedness, there's a lot of threads, right? So you got to peel the onion back a little bit. So first off, you want to be diversely connected to your carrier, right? So if you receive toll-free calls over the internet, or you have a WAN link of some sort, you want to make sure that link to the provider is physically and logically redundant, right? And then you want to make sure the carrier has lots of redundancy built within their network, their voice infrastructure, their routers or layer 3 switches. You want to make sure firewalls and all that kind of stuff that constitutes a carrier network has full redundancy. And then if you're leveraging other toll-free providers, then you want to make sure your connectivity to them is redundant. And then to the greatest extent possible, you want to see even beyond that into the local markets to make sure that there's not some local market impairment that's keeping that toll-free call from getting completed. So here, first example here is single carrier, right? This is an example of a carrier. This would probably be somebody that has a large toll-free network, somebody that probably feels like they don't really need to leverage anybody else. They've got this big toll-free network. They can originate calls all over the US or Canada or wherever their territory is. So they don't want to use somebody else. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're single-threaded, but you want to find out how this carrier Z is set up internally, because if you're connected to them and they're connected out into PSTN, if carrier Z has an issue in their toll-free network and all the stuff that makes up that network, and they can't complete calls to you, yes, they're single-threaded. So this could be an example of single threadedness. So this is a conversation you have with this carrier to make sure that that they've got all these, different scenarios accounted for. There's been some big toll-free outages in the past from single carrier networks, right, where they didn't have anybody else to route that call to, so they had to fix that problem before calls could flow again. So that's the one challenge with a single carrier like this.
Yeah, that's a good point there. So as we dig in, there's another example here, another scenario when somebody might be using what we consider to be kind of that toll-free aggregator. So in this example, help us understand just a little bit about the way that this is different from that single carrier model, and then how this introduces some of those unique challenges as a toll-free aggregator.
Yeah, so the big difference between an aggregator and the single carrier is the single carrier has a network, probably a large toll-free network. They just don't have any toll-free partners that they can route calls through if there's a problem. The aggregator, that's all they have. They don't have their own toll-free network. So the advantage of the aggregator is if they have calls on the East Coast that go through carrier A, and they have calls, in the Midwest that go through carrier B, or however they want to do it. If carrier A is having a problem, they have carrier B, C, and D that they can go into the SOMOS database, the toll-free database that governs how all these calls route, and route to somebody else. And then once carrier A's issue is resolved, they route it back. The challenge with the aggregators is they don't typically have their own network. And that's a problem for a couple of reasons. One, you never actually really control the bulk of the transit piece of that call, right? The call originates in the local market all the way to where they hand it off to the customer. They're using somebody else for 100% of their traffic. So they don't have as much visibility into, problems and repair. Every time there's a problem with toll-free service, they've got to open a ticket because that call is not traversing their network. And there can be some owner economics issues, right? If you have your own network, once you get to scale, now it's more cost effective than having to pay a partner, so you can pass some of those costs on to your customers. So the aggregators don't have that advantage too.
Yeah, great point there. So, and then this next example, as we kind of move through these three different options, this is going to look a little similar to the previous example there with the aggregator, but definitely some unique differences here that I'd love for you to kind of share with the audience. This is the representative example here of how we do things here at Bandwidth, but just talk a little about those fundamentals and what we did to build that 5 times redundancy at that carrier level, in for us, and how that works with the Bandwidth network.
Yeah, so a company like Bandwidth's kind of a blend of the first and the second example, right? We have our own network. It's in about 50, I think it's in 54 markets. It'll be in between 65 and 70 by the end of the year. So that's where our toll-free market lives. So an example, Atlanta's a toll-free market for Bandwidth. So calls in Atlanta are probably going to route to our own network. We take control of them right in that local market. We own it all the way to the core of our network that you see in LA, Dallas, Fort Worth, and New York. And then we build redundant interconnects to our customers. So we have our own network in addition to having Verizon, CenturyLink, and AT&T. Those are the three, when we talk about single carrier networks, those are the three biggest single carrier networks, along with Impact in Canada. So the advantage of this is we get the owner economics. There's a tremendous number of calls that we take onto our network locally and route into our core and then route into our customers. So we've got visibility. If there's an issue, it's ours to own, it's ours to ID, it's ours to fix. And then we're able to pass cost savings on to our customers. But for out of market or even in market, if there's an issue with our network or a tandem or a connection between the tandem and our network, or an SBC or a pair of SBCs go down, whatever, we've got the ability to pretty quickly to go into the database and say, hey, calls in Atlanta, for example, SMS database, don't tell the carriers that are originating these calls to route to us, route to Verizon or CenturyLink or Impact or AT&T, right? So 5 times the redundancy, right? And in addition to that, we have the tools, and this is typically AI and some machine learning tools that we provision to see deeper into the PSTN. So, if we have a market, let's say where Maine is an example. Maine is not a bandwidth market yet. So let's say we use Verizon to source calls in Maine. Verizon's got to get that call to us. They wouldn't hand it to us in Maine. Maybe they hand it to us in Boston or New York. So there's going to be a piece of the PSTN, right, between that caller in Maine and where Verizon picks up that call. So these tools allow us to see those local market issues and kind of, we're able to see the traffic and we're able to notice, hey, there's a problem. We should be getting calls out of Maine, or, pick your local market. We're not doing that. Must be an issue. Could be an issue with Verizon. Why don't, instead of rerouting to Verizon, we tell the originating carrier to route to CenturyLink or AT&T? Again, that's an issue that's not on our network. It's not on our interconnect to our own tandem. It's not on our interconnects to our partners' networks. It's beyond that. But those tools allow us to identify that and take action so calls can complete. So we have a really great story to tell. I mean, if a customer says, hey, I'm worried about single threadedness, we're able to say, okay, let's talk about single threadedness from the person sitting in their home, their business, their school, whatever, that picks up the phone and makes that call all the way to the person that answers it, because we've got a good story to tell about redundancy and failover.
Yeah, definitely. And that failover and redundancy component, really comes down to, as we were talking about this, getting ready for today, and just as we talk about it with customers, it comes down to a question that we're asked a lot on those calls, and it's, tell me a little bit about what bandwidth does specifically in the event of failover. When you guys are the RespOrg, tell me what it looks like in a couple different scenarios, just to continue to build that trust and responsibility into what we do here. So walk me through kind of a couple of these example scenarios as we look at, how bandwidth handles that redundancy and failover when we're the RespOrg.
Yeah, so if there's an issue with the bandwidth network or a partner network that we're using for out of market or cost or failover for whatever reason, if that provider, including ourselves, is having issues on the toll-free piece of the network, we would just go into the Somos database. Again, we see those really early. We go into the Somos database and just reroute that traffic either to ourselves if it's a partner provider, or a partner provider if it's ourselves, or another partner provider that's having an issue. So that's how we handle just the complete toll-free outage. A tougher one to do, and this is where carriers really separate themselves here, is what kind of visibility do you have in the broader PSTN, right? That's where those tools, those AI tools that we rolled out, that's where they make their impact. They're able to see beyond our own network, beyond our partners' networks, and beyond where they interconnect with us on the PSTN into local markets. And that we do the same thing. We go into the Somos database and say, hey, we believe there's probably a local market impairment in Boston or Detroit, or you pick your local market, and we route around them much the same way we do when there's a toll-free outage. This is just deeper into the PSTN. And then we've got two pieces of the toll-free core network. There's the piece that faces the PSTN, that faces carriers that are, they're the ones that are customers are using when they make the toll-free calls. Those are the originating providers. We have to be connected to them so they can get us those calls. And then we have SBCs that face our customers. We keep those separate for failover and for capacity management and some other reasons. But if a carrier SBC goes down, we connect all of our toll-free partners to all 4 of our points of presence, and they're redundant with each point of presence, and the points of presence are redundant to each other. So that is an automatic failover scenario. If a call normally would come in New York, we can route it to Atlanta, or vice versa. And then if a customer SBC goes down, same scenario, we trunk toll-free service from 2 geodiverse points of presence on our side. So customers have egress off our network into them at 2 geodiverse points of presence. So if, and we always recommend that customers have diverse points of presence on their side too, if it's an SBC or a PBX, to the greatest extent possible, have redundancy and failover there. We'll build our trunks from 2 points of presence to at least 2 points of presence on the customer side. So if we have an outage or the customer has an outage, there's an automatic reroute. So this stuff is generally transparent to a customer. It's generally transparent to an end user. When failover is invoked, it's automatic. Calls aren't dropped. So it's a pretty seamless process.
Yeah, and as we look at redundancy as a whole, this next chart here is taking a snapshot of that diagram and really kind of pointing out somewhat of the obvious, but also some of that those layers of redundancy that might get missed when you're just thinking about it, pretty narrow. Talk to us a little bit here about the differences between, that access redundancy, how that works and how that helps, the importance of that, and then that network redundancy that we've been talking about, how those two fit in together.
The only piece of the network or the only piece of this call flow that a customer is really responsible for, if you're dealing with a reputable carrier, is just connectivity to the carrier. Right? Again, if customers want their toll-free calls to come into their switch or their SBC, their PBX, whatever they're using, via internet, just make sure you've got redundant internet links, preferably, with multiple providers, run BGP, so that network stays up. If it's a WAN link, have multiple WAN links. Make sure they're physically diverse. Not the same fiber, not the same in the street. You can get down to if you're really worried about toll-free traffic. A lot of our customers are resellers, right? So they can't make any money. They can't charge their customers for toll-free if people don't answer the phone, or if there's an outage. So if toll-free is really important to you, and I assume it would be if you're on this webinar, you want to make sure that you get to that level of detail to have diversity into us. Then you need to do business with a carrier that takes on the responsibility and the ownership of making sure there are multiple paths and has that business continuity plan within their network and out into the PSTN. So really, any reputable carrier should only be telling their customers that their responsibility is diversity and redundancy into the carrier. The carrier should be taking care of the rest.
Yeah, great. So that's kind of covers it, I think, for myth number one. We'll dig into this second myth, which is the only way to save on costs is to maintain your own RespOrg. And I know that, everybody's thinking about cost savings. It's a big piece of the puzzle, especially these days. And, there's really two philosophies here, I think, when it comes to who manages the RespOrg for toll-free, right? It's that idea of doing it yourself, or the DIY kind of a model, where a customer might be their own RespOrg, or using a service provider or some sort of a third party to manage it, whether that's the carrier or a third party that manages it for you. And so wanted to dig in just a little bit as we look kind of to pull the curtains back on this idea of doing it yourself is the best way to have cost savings built in. And what's the allure of DIY cost savings? Well, as we dig into it, I think it's relatable to kind of mention something that might hit home, take it out of the telecom realm for a second, just even think about a simple appliance fix in your house, and how, if something goes wrong, you've got different options. You can do it yourself and fix it. You can call a professional to come in and fix it. And there's advantages and disadvantages to both, right? You have the potential to save on costs of parts if you get them yourself, potentially, save on diagnostic fees, but you end up trading off some things. And you wonder as you're doing that, what if I don't fix it? What if something else breaks and something even worse happens? The entire kitchen floods, for instance, if you're talking about fixing your dishwasher. You're out the cost of parts. You're also out a whole lot of time and headache as well. And you still have to call that professional. And so it's that timely dynamic of wondering if doing it myself makes more sense. Here's some of the reasons that we think, and we've heard from folks that do kind of start to consider what's that allure of DIYing with toll-free and with RespOrg themselves. And they're after control. They're after control on routing. They want to spin up the LCR engine. They want to maintain and manage that themselves. And that can give you some control. It also gives you a lot of that responsibility that you were talking about before. And we'll dig into that here in just a bit. But also, competition. It can help to force competition, and there's potential there for maybe being able to negotiate price. But I think there's some hidden kind of nuances to that we're going to dig into as well here as we start to debunk this myth. You're not locked into a shaky relationship with a bad vendor, so you've got some vendor leverage there. You can pit people against each other if you need to, but that also comes with its own challenges. And then, of course, risk mitigation. Everybody's trying to mitigate risk, and staying, so to speak, multi-threaded with multi-vendors is one potential way to do that. And that's really, interesting to look at, the allure of DIY cost savings, but that's also not even considering the costs and requirements of becoming a RespOrg. And so on this next screen here, we're looking at what does it take? What's involved in becoming RespOrg? There's a lot of different things that happen, and everybody's going to do it a little bit differently. But typically, you're going to pay a deposit to Somos to start to be able to get those numbers and interact with the Somos database. There's a 7-step service establishment form that you have to complete. You're going to have somebody in your organization that's willing to study for, take, and pass the RespOrg exam, and can be pretty pricey for a 5-day training class. But part of the bit there is to pass that exam so that you're certified, and then you've got to maintain all of this full-time expertise and some of the cost structures that go into actually managing it in-house. And that can be, to the tune of senior engineers on staff, escalation management that's 24/7. What do you do if something goes down in the middle of the night? Do you have somebody that can handle that? How fast can you do that? Invoice mediation is a big component of that as you're dealing with different carriers. Toll-free number porting management. You've got to be able to manage ports in and out and do that really effectively to create that good customer experience for your customers. Third-party management tools are some of those hidden fees as well that a lot of people don't think of up front, but they end up purchasing something that helps to build out the routing intelligence or helps to manage the system in the background. And then, of course, just owning and maintaining that toll-free number inventory, so that if you do this for your customers and you want to try to facilitate that instant provisioning, you've got to be able to maintain that inventory to be able to do so. And so just wanted to mention a couple of those things, but David, in your conversations with folks as well, there's these two kind of dynamics at play, and some of that we've talked about, but the costs on the front end versus the costs on the back end. Talk to me a little bit about how potential customers and folks who are looking at this or in a space of evaluating whether they should become their own RespOrg, what are the things they need to consider when it comes to those front end versus back end costs?
Yeah, so the myth is really kind of on the back end. So the front end cost, there's really two primary front end costs. There's the cost of the telephone number, the cost of the toll-free number, and the cost per minute, right? So if you're your own RespOrg, you're almost always going to save money on the numbers because you're going to get them straight from Somos. When you get them from the carrier will probably pay the same Somos fee, and they'll probably add a little bit on top of that. And that can be impactful if you have thousands and thousands and thousands of numbers. But that second upfront cost, the cost per minute, will typically you'll pay a little higher there, so it'll kind of eat away the cost savings on the numbers, and the MOUs are typically higher. And I'll give you the bandwidth example. Is customers will often say, well, hey, bandwidth, I have these relationships with all these different toll-free providers, so I play them against each other, and I get real low rates, and I have a bunch of minutes. Well, we do the same thing. And a carrier like Bandwidth that has their own network and also leverages others do the exact same thing, only Bandwidth's got billions of minutes with these providers. So the chances that a customer is going to have that kind of volume to negotiate a rate, in the neighborhood that we get, is probably not likely. I don't see that very often. Normally, when customers have us as the RespOrg versus themselves, they're paying more per minute to be the RespOrg. They're saving money on the number, but they're losing it on the MOU, right? So that's the front end cost. But the real cost, and this is hard to identify, is the back end cost. So you mentioned all the stuff it takes to get set up to be your own RespOrg. In addition to doing all that stuff, you as the RespOrg have to manage the relationships with the toll-free providers. You've got to manage the connectivity, and you've got to make sure that connectivity is diverse. You've got to manage contracts. You've got to manage pricing. And then you as the toll-free owner, you've got to take on the fix. You've got to take on issue, isolation, and repair if it's not within your toll-free provider's network. And that's a tough one. I go back to the machine learning tools that we use. Those aren't cheap. You've got to buy those. You've got to manage those to be able to see into the PSTN and go back in and reroute via Somos. And then, again, if toll-free is really important to you and you're making your money off toll-free, you got to have uptime. those calls have to complete. You got to have a 24/7 team, not just an individual. Individuals get sick, they go on vacation, they have problems, they go to sleep, right? So you've got to have a team, and they've got to have the expertise and the experience to be able to effectively do all that. Otherwise, calls aren't going to complete. And if your calls don't complete, one, you lose money because you're probably charged for toll-free service. And even if you're not, or even if that's not a huge part of the business, you're going to have really angry customers, and they're going to take the business away. So those costs on the back end, a little tougher to identify, but they will way, way more than make up any cost savings that you would have realized on those toll-free numbers.
Yeah, and I think as we look at, what are the reasons to consider that consolidated sort of savings approach, and trusting somebody that's more of that modern RespOrg service provider, potentially somebody like a Bandwidth that has that carrier network as well. You mentioned those PSTN insights, without having to manage that yourself, being able to resolve something if it happens downstream. I think that those are all really important. I think one of the things that, as we look at, what does this give you from an advantage perspective, you're freed up to innovate and to automate some more of those processes. If you're using somebody, that can handle that for you and do it really professionally, do it with the expertise, that expert routing and support. Again, it's that 24/7 coverage for those potential issues. Not even network-wide issues, although that's definitely a big component of that, but that local market outage and being able to surgically go in and kind of route around potential issues there. And even doing that from a proactive standpoint, if your traffic hasn't been impacted yet, but somebody else's traffic has been, at Bandwidth, we make that change so that it helps and benefits the entire roster of customers that are using that routing template. And so you get that advantage of potentially even not ever seeing any issues because of that proactive support there. And then, of course, those full service options, if you're looking to do something, as we talked about earlier in the session today, just talking about omni-channel approach and what it means to incorporate SMS as well as voice into a solution for customers. You've got to have somebody who can do all of that. And so finding a provider that can really handle that together and provides you those owner economics along the way. And then building trust with a single vendor, that helps you eliminate, multiple different types of support avenues, dealing with different SLAs, having to pit vendors against each other, and kind of winding up with that lack of a strategic value from a relationship with your vendor. Including even if you're into the automation and kind of software-centric space, dealing with different APIs is a simple way of looking at that. If you've got multiple vendors and you're trying to integrate toll-free from multiple vendors, you're going to have different APIs that you're dealing with there. So I think that covers kind of the big picture on myth number 2. Let's dig into kind of myth number 3. And I think this one is one of the biggest myths that we encounter with our customers. And so giving up RespOrg means you lose control over your toll-free service. David, kind of tell us a little bit about how you've seen this illusion of control, how you've experienced this illusion of control before, and how it plays itself out in other familiar industry changes along the way here, and how we can relate that to toll-free.
Well, you mentioned it, this is probably the biggest myth, the most common, and it's also the hardest one to get over. And I'll explain why. So when I have a lot of conversations, typically you have the cost savings conversation first. The customer would say, well, I want to pay more for my numbers and I'm getting this great rate. And then we show them, well, look, here's your cost savings actually if you go with us. And they're like, okay, great, but man, I don't want to give up control. And it reminds me a lot. I'm old enough to have been in telecom at the dawn of the cloud computing movement, right, when it was nascent. And that was a big deal then. It's kind of it still is impactful now, but back then you had so many customers that said, well, I've got my storage area network devices, I've got my application servers, my web servers, I've got my entire production environment. I control it, I own it, I can see it, I can touch it and feel it. If I put this into a cloud environment, I lose all of that, right? And that's a tough thing to get over, right? but it's an illusion. And so what happened was these customers, they went kicking and screaming largely because, some C-level executives say, hey, we got to do this because, my peers are doing this and they're saving money and they're getting all these advantages. And the IT folks, when they did it, they realized, gosh, I'm a retail company, or I'm manufacturing, or I'm healthcare, or I'm finance. I am not a data center provider. I am not an IT services and cloud computing provider. These cloud computing companies are, and they've got these really super robust facilities, and they have all these tools they use, and they give me access to this, and I can do a lot of stuff, but I don't have to get up in the middle of the night, or I don't have to manage this. These companies, and this is what they do for a living, and they have all this experience and expertise. They're doing it for me, and they started to realize, yeah, it actually does feel like I have control. Because most people, when they say they want control, what they really mean is they want peace of mind. Control is just a conduit to get that peace of mind. So in cloud computing, you saw that early on, where companies and they went into it kicking and screaming, but then they realized their uptime was better. Their InfoSec was better because they're dealing with companies who, if you're a cloud computing company, you have to have a secure network because that's what you're selling, right? And they felt a lot better about that. RespOrg is the exact same way. What customers really are going for a lot of times when they want to be RespOrg is they yes, control is what they want, but they really want peace of mind. And they think if I control routing, and if I control the interconnects, and if I control cost to vendors, and I don't have to depend on somebody else to do that, and I can touch and feel this thing, then I'm going to have better uptime. I'm going to have better reliability. I'm going to have calls that complete more often. I'm going to make more money. And it is the biggest illusion because of kind of things that we talked about in cost savings. I mean, responsibility is hard. Control is difficult. It's expensive. And if you're not set up right, and if you don't have a team of people, the expertise, and they're not 24/7, 365, and they don't have tools to see out into the PSTN, and they're not able to respond quickly, then you're gonna feel like you have control until you don't. And so the biggest issue is, oh gosh, bandwidth or whoever they're talking to, man, I'm now turning this over to you. I don't have control. What kind of how can I help manage this? Well, with bandwidth, we'll give you access into our dashboard, right, which is the portal for doing just about anything with bandwidth. You can order numbers, you can port them. We have a great porting process. A lot of this is automated. You can get new numbers on the fly in real time, vanity numbers in real time on the fly. You can set up trunks, you can set up failover redundancy, all that kind of stuff, and you can modify failover and redundancy, right? If there's an issue, all that stuff is done in real time in the bandwidth dashboard. So customers start to see, okay, one, this is more cost effective, and two, I feel like I'm giving up control, but I'm really not, because I still have a fair amount of control. I just don't have the responsibility, and that pretty quickly customers start to see, particularly when they'll have an outage and they'll get a notification like from us saying, hey, there's an outage, we're working on it, we're fixing it. And they see how quickly we got on it and how quickly we restored service. They start to realize they actually do have a lot of control, but they're just turning over the responsibility to a company who has billions and billions of minutes a year in toll-free, and whose one of their core functions is to be a toll-free provider. And so once you get past, that illusion, and once customers realize they still have, a fair amount of control, they start to see that peace of mind, maybe even better than they did before.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think, looking at the scenarios on the left, even on this slide, and just digging into, that false sense of control, and how some customers of ours even have felt these pains and really kind of dug in. And, it's that idea of getting a call on vacation because you're the only one that can fix an outage or an issue. Is that really the type of control that you want? Do you want to have to spend those countless hours staying on top of industry changes like TFN identity or stir shaken? How that impacts toll-free and the broader voice ecosystem. And then again, even simple things like the control, the controls that you think you have, but then what are you missing out on, right? Are you truly able to provide that instant provisionable toll-free number inventory to your customers or are you kind of having to do a lot of swivel chair manual processes in the background to be able to make all that work? And so, couple kind of thoughts about examples of customers, again, kind of looking out into how we've seen this in reality, right? So Phone.com is a customer of Bandwidth's, and I think this quote really speaks a lot for itself. They moved as they were growing, realized that those responsibilities and the responsibility for maintaining RespOrg on themselves, was inflating overhead and pulling the team away from their own core mission to kind of help delight customers and create more innovative communication solutions. And so this quote from Brent here, Bandwidth has evolved to become more than just a provider for us. We consider you guys to be a key strategic partner enabling the growth of our organization. I think really speaks back to kind of what you end up benefiting from, what advantages you get that you don't think about up front. You get the ability to really focus on software, focus on your business, focus on the things that drive better customer experiences for your own customers, while also having that strategic partner behind the scenes that can help manage those things, 24/7, as we've been talking about. And then another example here, with Evolve IP, another Bandwidth customer with Tollfree and using us as RespOrg here. Everything was smooth in the transition to Bandwidth as RespOrg. Ultimately, it comes down to that we trust Bandwidth. Wanted to get the management out of our hands and have somebody who could manage it better than we do now. And again, it really comes down to that trust we've built. And we talked a little bit about that before, and just the ability for those strategic relationships and somebody that you can call and that they're going to get down to and be able to dig into those PSTN insights as well as provide a solution fast. So digging in again as we kind of wrap up, just to share a little bit more about what Bandwidth, if you were looking at Bandwidth, if you're in a position to evaluate, what it might mean to move to a solution that's got that 5 times carrier redundancy, you're going to gain a higher quality solution for Tollfree with that core network geo redundancy, greater end user to end user calling. During our poll, we asked about dashboards and APIs. Sounds like a lot of the folks on this call specifically are interested in, what the dashboard could do for them. Enables that ordering in milliseconds through the portal, and we also have APIs that help integrate things into your own tools if that's something you're interested in. Lots of access to reporting and BDRs and call detail records and so on and so forth. Multiple toll-free number search options are available there. Great porting experience. We maintain great relationships with other carriers in the industry and have lots of back-end automations to help with that porting experience. We're super operationally simple, competitive rate decks and flat rate pricing available. We help you remove that admin work from Somos, or if you're using a third-party RespOrg management tool, can help eliminate that and eliminate carrier invoice mediation, the needs for those. And then we offer that white glove support, 24/7 monitoring we've been talking about, real-time incident response, as well as those automated tools, pairing with that direct human intervention from that 24/7 knock and tack team that really help to identify issues and proactively, work to resolve them. And we've got that ability to reroute traffic in minutes there. So kind of in conclusion here, as we wrap up, just wanted to leave you with these 3 ideas. We talked about the top 3 toll-free myths at the beginning. Want to walk away with 3 new toll-free truths. That 1, you can consolidate toll-free with one vendor and stay multi-threaded. We've kind of talked about how that works. 2, you can save on costs without maintaining your RespOrg. Talking about the advantages there from that owner economics perspective, as well as somebody with billions of minutes and a bandwidth being able to go and negotiate rates and then pass along some of those savings to our customers. And you can stay in control without being your own RespOrg tools, as well as just what does true control actually mean, and without that extra layer of responsibility there. So hopefully this was helpful and informative. I do want to leave us with a little bit of time here, as we dig into a few questions, and be happy to take your questions here, and then we'll kind of wrap things up. So Gerald, I think you you may be standing by and can jump back in here and help us navigate through some of those questions there.
Fantastic. Thank you for the great presentation there. Yeah, let's open up the floor here for questions. Just a reminder, you can submit them through the Q&A portal at the bottom of the platform. Let's start off by talking about APIs versus dashboards for ordering and porting. When does it make sense to integrate to bandwidth APIs versus just using your dashboard directly?
Well,
yeah, this is oh, go ahead, David. You jump in.
the beauty of the APIs is it's automated, right? And so if you're high volume and you get a lot of numbers, Google is a great example, right? So we power Google Voice in addition to a number of platforms. So there's a lot of local numbers and a lot of toll-free numbers that are moving out. So Google's got two choices. They can pay a team of people to sit in front of our dashboard all day long and order numbers and port numbers and disconnect numbers and move numbers and all that kind of stuff, or they can automate it via API. So couple different use cases. One, if you're already using APIs with your carrier or another carrier to do a lot of this stuff, that's an easy lift. Or if it's high volume, right, and you have a dashboard or a portal that faces your customers and you want those two dashboards to talk, you do that via API. So if you're a toll-free provider or you're a voice provider and toll-free's part of your product set and you have a dashboard that your customers go to, if they want to order a toll-free number, you're going to order that primarily maybe from a company like Bandwidth, you're probably going to want to automate that. So when your customer goes into your dashboard to them and they order a toll-free number, your dashboard on the back end will send API to ours on the back end to go grab a number. So those are probably the most popular use cases.
Okay, next question for you here. Is there a point when it still might make sense to be your own RespOrg instead of using somebody like Bandwidth?
It does, yeah. And if you're typically a larger toll-free provider and you need access to, on a regular basis, we have a tremendous number of toll-free numbers in our inventory, and most carriers do, most large carriers do. But there are use cases where if you're doing maybe call analytics and some other stuff, call tracking, maybe the bulk of your calls are toll free, and you're giving toll free numbers out to every customer and all these campaigns, and you need just thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of phone numbers. Maybe you want access to the full Sonos inventory instead of your carrier's inventory, or you're just a really big toll free provider. Although we've won one of the bigger toll-free providers around, just moved their RespOrg from them to us. So even if you're a really big provider, maybe still doesn't make sense. But I can see a company that has made the investment in personnel and a team of toll-free providers that has maybe long-term contracts or embedded relationships with toll-free vendors. They've already provisioned all the diverse interconnects and done all this kind of stuff, and they have just specific requirements that maybe being their own RespOrg does matter. So there are times, they're rare, I don't see them too often, but there can be customers that can make a pretty good case for being their RespOrg.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that too. I think, David, you were talking a lot about this when we were hovering on that myth number 2, kind of talking about the DIY model versus somebody, giving up RespOrg but trusting it to somebody else. I think it really does come down to also kind of looking out ahead and looking at what you're potentially trading when it comes to that business, strategy and potential for innovation there. If you're having to continue to make investments, things aren't going to be exactly the same way they are today in a couple of years from now. And so if you're continuing to want to make those investments into the tools and the people and the strategy there for toll-free, just kind of taking a step back and just exploring and evaluating what might you be trading in at the expense of, having to continue to make that investment might also help clue in kind of when does it make sense to continue to be versus when it doesn't. It's really looking out ahead at kind of what your vision and strategy is for the future as a company as well.
All right, very good. I think that should wrap up today's webinar. Big thank you to Travis and David, to the entire Bandwidth team, and of course to all of you for attending today's event. To access this webinar on demand, please head over to channelvisionmag.com/webinars. Also, please keep an eye out for a follow-up email from Channel Vision. Thanks, stay safe out there, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.